Hi and welcome back to the channel. This time, having finally got my salvage auction recovered and repaired Lexus IS250 back on the road, everything sorted and good to go, I think it's time to answer the question, does it actually make a sensible daily driver 16 years after it first came out? Well, let's find out. So for those of you that have already followed this channel for a while, thank you, you'll know that this is a Lexus IS250 2007 SEL 2.5 litre V6 that I pulled out of a scrap auction as a non-running, effectively salvage car. I've put a new engine in, did a lot of brakes and suspension work, a lot of interior cleaning and just generally getting it looking presentable again. And it's now being pressed into service as my daily driver. The question, not so much of all the work I've done before, but now that it's in the state it is, which is comparable with other cars, does it actually make sense as a daily driver in this day and age? So, to go back a little bit, this is a second generation Lexus IS, so it's the XE20 body type, starting off from the original first gen, which came in introducing the infamous Lexus lights to the world, which every single boy racer across the known universe then immediately tried to copy. But as an actual car, the first generation was pretty good. It handled really well, it had a decent range of gearboxes, it had a 2JZ engine in at least some of the options, which was, for those of you who had a Supra or know that those engines, they're very good and can be tuned ridiculously high levels of power. And it was an overall good platform. Now the second generation moved that on a bit and to my mind introduced a far nicer overall styling look for the car that I think still stands up well today. Contemporarily, it still looks modern, fresh, and I really like the lines and the proportions of this generation of Lexus IS, whereas Lexus went a little bit, to my mind, overly fussy in their more recent options. I don't dislike them, but I think this is just a nice, simple, good design language that they've used here. So from the outside, I think, definite success. They had a range of options in terms of gearbox and engines, principally two similarly derived 6-speed manual gearboxes, the RA series, which based on a truck gearbox weren't really that good, more on that in subsequent videos. And then from an automatic side of things, you had the A960E 6-speed automatic transmission, which is what this car itself is equipped with. More on that later. Engines. Initially it was a 2.5 litre V6 offered in the UK, quickly followed by a 2.2 litre diesel. In the US and other markets there was a 3.5 litre V6, which unfortunately we didn't get in the UK, and then later on the 5 litre V8 ISF, which I won't be covering here. I'm keeping to the standard sort of normal run-of-the-mill ISs. So the diesel again we can come to later. This car in particular is a 2.5 litre V6 with, as I said, that 6-speed automatic gearbox, both of which we'll deal with on the test drive. In terms of spec and interior, I still think these stand up very well today. Trim and equipment levels are absolutely superb. Now this is an SEL, which is effectively top spec, but if I just start from right to left so I don't forget anything, it's got pretty much every feature you'd care to name. There's an automatic sunshade at the back, which my little one finds quite useful, just to keep out that sunlight and so on. Front window washers, which because it's got xenon headlights, that's a mandatory thing. Also though, a heated front screen, not the full screen effect that Ford has, but it's just around the outside. There's heating elements that on a cold day just gets the screen demisting that bit quicker. On the main side of things, it's fully voice activated, telephone Bluetooth connection, which still works fine with my modern iPhone. You've got a decent sound system with a Mark Levinson radio and a variety of speakers and so on around there, which again, in terms of in-system setups, I'm not an audiophile, but it's a really nice sound and everything works perfectly. Moving up from that, it's got a 6-disc CD changer, for those that still listen to CDs, never used it myself. A relatively competent navigation system if you've got the most recent disc in it, that does take you where you need to go, but does only do the first 5 digits of a postcode, so you do need to know a little bit more detail than full postcode whenever you're taking it anywhere, which is a little bit of a pain. But other than that, full climate control, cruise control, if you can think about it, this thing pretty much has it. Heated and cooled seats, Sport mode for the gearbox, but again we'll deal with that on the drive. Automatic dimming mirror, full leather interior. This one's a little bit battered because of miles, but it's still held up reasonably well and still looks decent. Memory seats, fully electrically adjustable seats, and a whole variety of other functionality. It's not short of kit is what I'm basically saying, and it's a very comfortable place to be. I personally find these seats among the most comfortable I've had in a car, and for long drives, as someone whose back tends to hang out a little bit, it's actually really comfortable for me, and I find it a nice place to be. In the back, as you can see, there's room enough for a child seat, and it's got ISOFIX points in the rear, and we do have a child seat in there. For rear passengers, the headroom is a little bit tight for those of us that are about 6 foot or over, but for my wife who's under that height, and for other sort of normal sized adults, it's perfectly comfortable, and with a little bit of adjustment of the seats, there's a decent amount of leg room. So overall, I have no issues with this car on the inside. The spec levels are impressive, and it's a nice place to be, and certainly stands up against modern contemporaries. A little bit less so on the in-car entertainment, but as I said, it's a 16-year-old car. What do you expect? And it's got decent sound, decent enough nav, and enough functionality to connect your phone to. There's also aftermarket options you can look at to integrate things like Apple CarPlay and Android into it through the existing head unit, so all is not lost there. In terms of spec levels across the range, however, as I said, this one is an SEL. Other specs, there's quite a few in various different special editions and so on, so I won't go into those in too much detail. But the main spec level you'll find in other cars is SE, which tends to drop at times either the leather, the nav, and certainly a lot of the functionality in terms of rear shade and so on, and also, most importantly, I find the xenon lights, which is a massive improvement over the standard lights I've found, and definitely an option worth looking out for if you're looking for one of these. But what you can find is quite a few SEs and lower models have been spec'd up to some degree, but what I would say that I would personally look for is definitely the xenon headlights, if possible the rear shade, although that's more of an SEL optional extra unfortunately, and not as important if you don't have kids, and definitely the navigation unit, and if possible that Mark Levinson sound system. Leather interior goes without saying, unless you really prefer cloth, but really those are the key levels of trim and equipment that I would say are worth looking for in these cars regardless. So now, having gone through the spec and the equipment and the exterior and all the rest of it, I think it's about time we looked at how it drives. So let's set off. Foot operated emergency brake as well, which does catch a few people out. Anyway. Initial impressions of this engine and this car, from my side anyway, is it is a really nice, smooth ride, overall handling, and just general driving experience. I like this car. I've driven one a long time back and chose my Honda Accord over it, primarily because the one I looked at before was a diesel. Again, more on that in future videos. But this one, with the 2.5 litre V6 petrol, is a really, really nice place to be and a nice car to drive. So let's start with the engine itself. It's a 4GR FSE 2.5 litre V6 engine with 204 horsepower, 185 pound-feet of torque, and a really nice smooth power delivery. Using D4S direct injection, more on that later, gives it a reasonable economy, and I'm tending to get in the high 30s on mainly motorway and aero driving. The official combined cycle is about 28-29 to the gallon, which is not that good, but it's also not that bad either considering the size of the engine. It's a reasonably economical car, and again with 204 horsepower, around an 8-second 0 to 60, it's not going to set the world on fire, but it's certainly not slow either. It's a nice amount of power, a nice amount of speed for when you need it, and perfectly smooth and refined when you don't. So overall, and especially having got right into the guts of one of these when I was putting the new engine in, relatively easy to work on. The sits comfortably in the engine bay, a fairly good DIY prospect. The main issues that you'll find with these is not in the comfort or the smoothness, it's that direct injection system. And as with many other early direct injection systems where it's purely just the direct injection rather than mixed with port injection, you do get carbon buildup. And that's one of the main Achilles heels of these engines, is if you do not maintain them, if you do not change the oil regularly, and if you don't periodically clear that carbon out, you are going to have problems, most especially with just general bad running and so on, but also you get a lot of contamination of the oil if you don't keep it nice and clean, and what can eventually happen is that can cause piston rings to stick and start causing scoring in the bores, as I indeed saw on the old engine that I pulled out of this car. Is that an issue? Not if you service it regularly and use good oil, change it regularly, and also periodically clear that carbon out, which is no different from many other direct injection cars of the time. So I wouldn't regard that as a particular weak point of this engine, more just of the direct injection system in particular. I'm certainly finding this one to be absolutely fine. Gearbox wise, although they did come with a manual gearbox, and normally that would have been my first choice, I have found, having driven other examples of it, the RA series of gearboxes to be a little bit, well, more than a little bit, agricultural in nature. And although there is an advantage to just being able to swap cogs yourself, the A960E 6-speed automatic gearbox attached to this engine does suit the engine very well and does make driving overall a really smooth, unflustered experience. The one thing I will pick up out of that though is, by being smooth, it has to be quite slow and deliberate and considered in its changes. So therefore, if you're just driving in normal D mode without the power mode engaged on the transmission, it is fairly lazy. If you want to hustle along a little bit, it does take a little bit of time to catch up with what you want to do and put itself in the appropriate gear. However, when you do engage the sport mode on the gearbox or the power mode on the gearbox, that does sharpen it up quite a bit, and it's not bad. I'm not a massive fan of automatics at the best of times, but for normal driving, this is fine. And in the power mode, when you put your foot down, it does go. Now there was about 1 second delay there, but that was a full foot flat to the floor acceleration. If you're driving around normally, it's normally not too bad to respond. And critically, if I put it in sport mode, I then get the gear indicator on the central dial binnacle here, and I can use my flappy paddles, and that transforms it quite significantly. Now, although I can make it hold a gear, and that was in second gear, and I'm now in third gear, and what it'll do is not change up any further than third, and therefore I can rev it out and it won't up change or do anything else. So you can control the engine quite well. But if I put it in fourth now, which is about the right gear for this speed, and then I put my foot down, it will still down change, because the way Lexus sets up its sports modes and its gearboxes, let's go back into drive, when you put it in fourth, it'll use any gear from first to fourth depending how it senses your throttle input, your speed, and what you want to do. Same thing with fifth, it's first to fifth, and sixth is first to sixth. So what you're really doing with the paddle shifts is telling the gearbox what you want it to go no higher than. Now, is that a pain? Sometimes, because as with the XKR I've got, the gear you're in is the gear it sits at, and it will accelerate within that gear. It'll only down change if you properly kick down and go for it, whereas this one's a little bit more flexible. But actually, even just being able to limit the top gear it's using and control it yourself from the paddles gives you enough flexibility and enough freedom to control the gearbox a lot better, and to me it's an acceptable compromise between a full automatic and a manual gearbox, which is what I'd normally prefer, but in this case it's the automatic with the flappy paddles. And as you'll see in a subsequent video, I've taken that concept into the GS430 I've got as well, and put one of these steering wheels on that GS for exactly that reason, to allow that paddle shift controlled changes. And when you're feeling lazy, just slap it back into D and let the gearbox do all the work. So in terms of overall pros on that gearbox, for daily driving in traffic and normally about town, it is super smooth, utterly reliable. They do not really fail unless you mistreat them horrendously, and a really nice combination with this engine. The cons are, if you do like to push on and use all 204 of those angry horses, it's a little bit slow, a little bit lazy, but as I said, that can be changed with the paddle shift and brought back into being quite a nice combination. So overall, in terms of what we have in the UK for these cars, the 2.5 litre petrol engine with the 6-speed automatic gearbox would be my personal choice. Having driven the 2.2 diesel and also the manual 250, I would say that this is the most acceptable overall compromise, especially if you're looking at a daily driver. And now we come to me, the most important part of any car I have, which is how it actually drives. And by that I mean both the compliance over bumps and lumps on the road, which me living in Devon is a fairly consistent fact of life on back roads, but also how it handles. And there is a difference. I can make a car as soft as I want and have it rolling all over the place, a very boaty ride, and actually be uncomfortable and start actually making your passengers feel a bit nauseous. So what I want is that ideal combination of both ride compliance but also handling accuracy. And that's a balance. You're never going to get entirely one way or the other, but you can certainly go a long way towards it. And this car, to me, I would say is one of the best compromises of ride and handling that I've encountered in a straight out of the box OE fashion. It is super smooth over bumps, and actually other people that have driven it have compared it favourably and really commented well on that too, on its ability just to soak up actually quite heavy bumps in the road and still remain composed and compliant and keep you nice and comfortable. So that's one side absolutely ticked, and I'd say it's one of the best riding cars I've got in that regard. So much so I got another one, but that's another story for another video. What we then move on to, and unfortunately I'm stuck in traffic right now so I can't really open it up a bit, and hopefully we'll do that in a second, but the overall handling of it as well is actually surprisingly good. Now Lexus have a traditional approach of refinement and comfort over handling, but with the IS, especially with the first gen, they did try and make something that handled in a more sporty manner. And while the first gen is arguably the best in that regard, the second gen is still no slouch, and I would still say is a really good alternative to the likes of your BMW 3 Series and other sort of traditionally good handling small executive cars at the time. So now as traffic's cleared and we're getting onto a little bit more of a usually empty back road, let's talk about handling. Now as you can see, going over some fairly stinking bumps there, although there is a little bit of a thump coming through, the suspension actually does a really good job of smoothing out those bumps and things with manhole covers, potholes, etc. And the thing is, you can have rock hard suspension, which is great on a racetrack if it's nice and smooth, but ultimately, to keep good handling on roads like this, you need the tyres to maintain contact with the ground. And if the suspension is rock solid and doesn't adhere to the changes in the road surface and shape and so on, then what you're actually doing is removing handling, because you're removing that contact patch with the ground while the car's in bump and rebound. So actually that slightly softer setup in this IS actually makes it handle really well as ride really well, and it's a good compromise. And this is a pretty honking road that I'm driving on right now, and this car is just soaking it up. I'm feeling confident in the steering, although I'm not going that fast, but there's traffic ahead of me again. But the point is, it works really well as a combined package. In terms of grip when cornering, it's pretty good. There's no real issues with a good set of tyres on. I don't have any issues in the wet, and it's obviously a pretty wet and stinky day today, but it just handles, grips and goes. Interestingly, the tyres are 245 40 17s on the back and 225 45 17s on the front. So the front is actually a narrower cross section than the rear, and that does actually give the steering quite a good lightness to it without really noticeably impacting front end grip. Not that I've seen anyway. One thing it does create though is a risk that if you pull up close to a curb in normal driving, the first point of contact with that curb is going to be the alloy, not the tyre. So if you do look at Lexus ISs with that staggered setup in terms of tyre size, that's one of the reasons why you see the front wheels are normally curbed absolutely all over the place. And unfortunately, the only thing you could do about that is either be really careful, which is what I do, or put 245 section tyres on the front, which other people do. I've not done that myself to work out whether that affects the handling or not, or the steering. But certainly you do need to be careful of those front alloys. But as you can see, on a fairly wet and stinky road just now, it doesn't have any issues handling. In terms of the steering, it's an electric power steering rack, but nevertheless, and I'm not a massive fan of the concept, I prefer a more hydraulic sort of connected system, but I've certainly got no problems with the feedback it's given me on this rough road. I can feel where the tyres are, I can feel what they're doing, and I certainly don't feel disconnected from how the car's driving and what it's up to. And in terms of performance, as said, 8 seconds not to 60. I've actually managed better than that, but it's not that far off. It's in the kind of high 7s if you get a good launch. So it's not going to set the world on fire, but for daily driving, it's got enough power, and it does sound nice once it's warmed up. A little bit clattery on cold because of the direct injection, but once it's all warmed up and running fine, it's a nice, smooth, quiet engine, apart from when you put your foot down, so no complaints there. Pothole mid, cornering, bumps, composes itself, carries on. Other cars I know would have been jiggling all over the place with that. But now, heading on to more well-maintained roads, A roads, etc. That's where this thing is just a really superb, comfortable mile muncher. And I've done a lot of miles in this already since I put it back together. I commute about 3 hours each way every week just to get to my work, and this for quite a while was the car of choice to do that because the seats, the ride, the steering, just the general sort of feel of this car was just really comfortable over long drives. And the economy I was getting on those long drives was in the kind of mid-30s. Sometimes if I was being really boring, I'd get into the upper 30s, and even once or twice I touched 40 to the gallon. Now admittedly you need to be a proper like geeky hypermiler to do that kind of thing, but it's not outrageous. And one thing I did forget to mention, so I'll jump in now, is in addition to the overall steering and handling, the brakes, 2 pots up front, 1 pot in the rear, are perfectly adequate. They're actually, well, more than adequate, they're actually pretty good. There is upgrades, as I'll cover in later videos, where you can stick on the 4-pot calipers from a Lexus GS, and that makes it better again, but the overall improvement is not actually that great, considering where you're starting from. These are actually a good setup, and they certainly don't feel like the car is ever going to hesitate to pull up after you've been giving a little bit of enthusiastic driving. It's just an overall well-rounded, does what it needs to do package. Summing up, so I said at the start of this video, or I posed the question at the start of this video, is this car at 16 years old with a 2.5 litre petrol engine in this day and age still viable as a daily driver? And I would say, depending on your requirements, absolutely yes. Starting off from the positives, it's a comfortable place to be, it's a really nice looking car, it has a really good level of equipment, even as standard, but in the SEL spec, even more so, and it's more than comparable with contemporary cars today. In terms of the engine, I've already said it's smooth, it's got enough power, it's pleasant to use, got a nice sound to it, and most importantly in this day and age, it's not that uneconomical. 30 to the gallon is not unrespectable, and most importantly, from a British perspective, it's Euro 4 compliant, and therefore it still escapes the ultra low emission zone charges that are about to hammer most of London in the next few months. stand fast where that goes in the future, but right now it is still ULEZ compliant and therefore perfectly viable if you're going to drive around in and around the southeast of England, whereas a lot of diesels nowadays need to be Euro 6 plus to be in that same state, which is therefore creating a big problem for a lot of people that moved over to diesel. Petrol in terms of price is coming back down, it's still cheaper than diesel, and this thing with the sort of 30s to the gallon it's getting is not that far off what you get if you had a diesel one of these with its 40 plus to the gallon, but diesel being 10-15 pence a litre more expensive. So from an economy point of view, it still makes sense. From a ride and handling point of view, I personally rate this higher than a lot of more modern stuff I've driven with work and so on, and I think it still makes sense. Price wise, they are pretty cheap. I mean, this one I got for about £900, but the reality is, to get it into the condition that it's in now, I've spent around about £4,500 to £5,000 in total, depending how you cut it. Now, there's areas where I could have saved money, I could have done things a little bit more on the cheap, but that was a personal decision of where I was going to take this car and what I was going to do with it. But realistically, buying one straight rather than from a salvage auction, you can start around the £2,500 to £3,000 mark, anything up to 5, 6, 7 for a much lower miles, better condition example. But about £5,000 to £4,000 should be about the sweet spot where you can find, if you're willing to look, a pretty good example. Road fund licence for the 2.5 and the automatic gearbox is around about the £370, £380 a month. It tends to go up every year, but that's about what I'm paying now. Interestingly, with the manual gearbox, it goes up to about £500 or plus because there's higher emissions with the manual gearbox. Another reason why I'm recommending this engine with the automatic, not the manual. So overall, I'll go back to the question, does it make sense as a daily driver? Yes. There are more economical cars, but they're generally diesel, and as I've just said, diesel is now getting hammered for low emission zones across all the different cities in Britain, and therefore petrol just allows you to hang on at a fairly relatively low entry price point, and without having to go to the full electric, have you got £40,000, sir, which is one of the other alternatives. And as said, 40 grand for a daily driver car is outside of the reach of most mere mortals, and therefore I would say you're looking at something like this, a decent petrol alternative that is comfortable, looks decent, still looks contemporary, has a good level of kit, decent performance, reasonable economy, and is fairly frugal to run compared to some of the alternatives. As a recommendation as a daily driver, I'd say go for it. They're lovely cars and also super reliable. Again, when you compare where BMW has been recently as one of the alternatives to this, I would not have a 3 Series over this, because I don't want to be fixing it all the time. And on that bombshell, Lexus equals reliable, I'll end this video and just say, if you've liked it and enjoyed it, if it's been useful for you, then please let me know by hitting the like button and commenting what you think down below, positive and negative, because it's all useful. If you do like this kind of content and want to find out where I'm going with the new daily driver and this and all the other things that are in the fleet, consider subscribing, and it does help. But if not, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.